Welcome to the Recovery Effect Podcast with Bill Vineyard. Recovery is Bill's passion and his life's work of 30-plus years. Now it's your turn to experience the Recovery Effect, a powerful mix of recovery, spirituality, philosophy, and most importantly, living life as your true self. Now here's your host, Bill Vineyard.
So this here is part 3 of God and Fear, ending the series that we started a few weeks ago with part 1. You know, I hope you've all gained a lot from this series. I know I've had fun presenting them to you, even though this one seemed to be the hardest one of all, because the solutions for fear is somewhat difficult. It's kind of like dieting. You know, when you quit drinking, you quit drugging, you just remain totally abstinent from alcohol and drugs. But when a person diets, they still have to eat. They just can't remain totally abstinent from food, and fear is a lot like that. We'll never go through our life absolutely devoid of any fear. Fear is a part of us. It's a part of our community. It's part of our world. And we'll never get through life totally without fear. I doubt if we'd even want to. I guess what we can hope for is to ask God to remove our fears and what's left, try to reduce them as much as possible, and use spiritual principles to live with the rest, and learn to not allow them to control any part of our life. I hope by the other podcasts that you've learned that fear is a spiritual problem. It comes from the physical, making a living, but the solution to any spiritual problem has to be answered with a spiritual solution. You can't solve a spiritual problem with a physical answer, like if you have a fear of not being able to survive, a fear of living on the street or losing your home, things like that. And this fear is affecting your home life, your relationships. It's got you paralyzed. You're frozen in time. You think about it all the time. It possesses you. That is a spiritual problem. But our answers at times are physical solutions. Make enough money, get our house paid off real fast. Then I won't be scared of anything. Well, we simply know that that does not work because it's not true. That's not the answer. So I hope we've all realized that fear is, number one, a spiritual problem requiring a spiritual solution. I also hope that these last podcasts that you've realized that making a living causes us to compare. We have this problem of comparing ourselves to others, which generates fear because we might not have as much money as they have or as much possessions. And we always see these people as being better than we are, and we don't have as great as retirement account as they have, and we just need to stop comparing ourselves to others. We also realize that we compare one day to another. We compare back when we were drinking in 1995 to 2015. It isn't the same day, and we're not the same people. So we need to discontinue that type of comparing. Another thing we learned is not knowing. Not knowing how to live produces a tremendous amount of fear. Can't pay our taxes, can't stay in a relationship, can't hold a job. We just don't know how to live. We don't even know what to believe. And so this not knowing causes fear, and sometimes that even goes into terror. We also have a fear of the unknown. This keeps us from taking any risk. Because, see, the unknown can never be known. So we want to stay in our comfort zone. Never leave our comfort zone to take a risk to jump off that cliff because of the fear of the unknown. We also talked about a failure of self-reliance, that we have to accept that we're powerless over some things in life. We can't stop floods or tornadoes or volcanoes, earthquakes, things like that. Even mention that we don't have anything to do with the water that falls on the ground, that raises the grass to feed the cows on the food we're going to eat tonight. We're just a lot more powerless than we realize. And in the end of these podcasts, we realize that probably where we can stop and identify most of our fear comes from self-centered fear. That came from the 12 by 12 in step 7. Self-centered fear is this fear that we're going to lose something that we have or not get something that we want. How ridiculous to think that we're going to go through life never losing anything we have and always getting what we want. I mean, that puts us on a plane of just total demands. We demand so much from life, so much from God, so much from others, so much from self. And these demands can't be met. They simply cannot be met. And when they're not met, we tremble. and we live our life in a state of unsatisfied demands. What a terrible way to live. So this fear is such an evil and corroding thread that seems to shoot through the fabric of our existence of life, as the Big Book says, that we look for freedom from fear, which in my opinion can be a very unrealistic expectation. I think we could make the removal of fear a lifetime undertaking and could never really be totally resolved. No one is completely free of fear. What we can do is best try to rid ourselves of as much fear as possible and use spiritual principles on the rest. But the one thing that I think we need to take a look at is faith has to be the foundation to free ourselves from fear. Faith in the fact that no matter how crazy life seems, it still makes sense. That there's some kind of deity that's in charge of all this mess, and no matter what happens, it's still on track, it's still on schedule, and it's going to make sense. Of course, that does require faith. As the great philosopher Kierkegaard said, we never understand life forward, we always understand it backwards. And if you'll think about that for a minute, if you can look back on your life, you'll be able to understand a lot of questions that you had at that moment. You can understand life looking back. You can never understand life looking forward. So at some point in time, maybe even in the next world, we'll understand things. We'll understand why this happened and that happened. But right now, we're just going to have faith in the fact that there is a power greater than ourselves that's in charge of all this mess, and it will be okay. Faith is not as hard to have as one would think. Modern-day perception of faith seems to resemble magic more than a spiritual principle. They lead us to believe that we can satisfy our own selfish desires for money, sex, fame, or so on, if we just have the faith. The people who shout this from the rooftops are doing nothing more than playing spiritual make-believe. It's like when you was a little kid and you'd tell the other little friend of yours that you wish on the first star you see tonight, and that wish will come true. Or, if you rub this rock 3 times, if you got it out of a creek, your wish will come true. That's just make-believe. And these people who talk about if you have enough faith that you can get all the money you need or all the fame or whatever endeavor you're after is nothing more than just spiritual make-believe. And don't fall for it. Faith isn't like that. It's much more powerful and realistic than those would lead you to believe. I mean, wasn't it an act of faith to admit our powerlessness? Wasn't when you got to the bottom, when you got to where you could go on no further, it was an act of faith that you jumped off that cliff and believed in the program and God and the steps and started doing the things you needed to do to stay sober and clean? And then all of a sudden a month passed, and 6 months, and a year, 2 years, 10 for some of us and more. But didn't it begin with the first step of faith that this is going to work? An act of faith by coming to believe? In some form or other, all the 12 steps are an act of faith. So you can see that faith, real faith, is obtainable. I know that Bill Wilson says that the basic antidote for fear is a spiritual awakening. Spiritual awakening found in the steps. The steps are a spiritual awakening, especially the 4th step, when it says we ask Him to remove our fear and direct our attention to what He would have us be. And it goes on to say, at once we commence to outgrow fear. It didn't say that we at once lost all fears, but it said at once we commence to outgrow fear. It also says that another antidote for fear is to watch for fear, and when it crops up, we ask God at once to remove them. We immediately discuss them with someone. These are the principles we need to follow. These are the principles that were made for us, the addict. I mean, sure, they'd probably work with the non-addict, but this program was tailor-made for us in every area and for every area of our life. A lack of work in the program, which means, in other words, a failure to adopt spiritual principles, is a main cause of continued fear. Some would like an easier, softer way. Medication, psychotherapy. Some of us use gambling, drugs, all sorts of things. But there are no easier, softer ways. Just as you could not continue with alcohol or drugs as your courage to reduce your fears, neither can you use medication to control your moods. eventually it quits working. The problems that work in the program centers around a lack of sponsorship, or not using your sponsor, not reading all the literature that's available to us. Not just a chapter here, a chapter there, a paragraph here, a paragraph there. Dive into those books. Read them. See what they say. See the principles that they're trying to teach you to live. And work the 12 steps of the program that you're involved in. Not treatment center steps. Those aren't the 12 steps. I know a guy one time that came to me and told me he had already done his 4th step in treatment. And I said, well, what did it consist of? And he told me that he wrote a 1-page biography of his life. That's not a 4th step. That's not even close. People, you don't want to put a Swin bicycle together with Cannondale bicycle instruction sheet. It just won't work. So if you're going to work the 12 steps, work the 12 steps that comes from the program that you're involved in. Now ask yourself a few questions. Did you really decide to turn your will and life over to the care of God as you understood Him? Did you really do a 4th step, especially on fear? And have you brought God into these fear situations that you're involved in? Things that are causing you panic attacks? Things that you lay in bed at night and worry about? Have you really brought Him into these fear issues that you're dealing with? And as the book says, when these fears crop up, do you talk to another human being, preferably your sponsor, about them? You know, in dealing with fear, it requires more than just going to meetings and saying a quick prayer in the morning and one at night. If you want more out of this program, you've got to put more into it. And in dealing with these fears and wanting to be free of these fears, you're going to have to put more into it to get that out of it. They just don't go away like magic. There are a few steps that you have to take. Let me give you a little role-playing exercise that I have found to be simple but very effective. We're going to need 2 chairs for this exercise. I want you to take one chair and put it right in front of the one you're sitting in. So you're sitting in one chair and there should be an empty chair facing you. Now I want you to imagine that in the chair facing you is God. Now you see, the Big Book says that we find God deep down within us. As a matter of fact, that's the only place we can find Him. So when you're answering these questions, what we want to do is go deep down within us to find the answer. So sit in the chair in front of the God chair, the empty chair, and tell God your fear. Tell that empty chair, which God is sitting in, the fear that you have. It might go something like this. God, I have a fear that I won't be able to support myself and my family. Or, God, I have a fear that I might lose my job. Or, it might be a future fear that you have. Say, God, I have a fear if I take this other job, it might not work out. Now, get up out of your chair and go over there and sit in the empty chair, and now you're going to play the role of God. Something that you've probably always wanted to be. Well, here's your chance. So now that you're sitting there in the role of God, imagine the person in front of you, which was you, said to God, which is you now, what his fear or her fear was. In my case, it would be like, God, I'm scared that if I take this job, it might not work out. Now God's heard that. Now go deep down within yourself, and how would God reply to that? Find that reply, that answer, within yourself. After you've found the answer, let God reply. Let Him say that answer back to the empty chair, which is you. It might go something like this in my scenario. I guess if I was God in my own scenario, I would ask me this question. Bill, what do you think will happen if it doesn't work out? Now what we need to do, after God has answered back to our fear, is that we need to get up out of the God chair and go back and sit in the other chair, which is you, and God's in that chair. Now I want you to imagine as you're sitting there, this whole scenario. Say to God, whatever your fear is. Like in mine, it was, God, I'm scared if I take this new job, it might not work out. And then imagine what God says back to that. Well, what is it that you're scared of if it doesn't work out? And my reply to that would be, I'm scared I won't survive. I'm scared I won't be able to take care of my family. And what do you think God would say to that? Well, let's find out. Get up out of that chair, go over there and sit in the God chair. Now imagine that you're God, and this person tells you his fear. In my case, it's, God, I'm scared if I take that job, it might not work out. And then God replies, well, what is it that you think will happen? And then you reply back to God, that empty chair does, I'm scared that I won't be able to take care of me and my family. And what would God's reply to that be? Go deep down within and think about that. What I think God would say to me, if that was my fear, was, Bill, I've taken care of you all these years, even when you was drinking. I've never once let you down. And no matter what happens from this day forward, I won't let you down. I'll be with you through it all. Now, get up, go back and sit in that chair, and go through the whole scenario again. And say, God, I'm scared if I take this job, it might not work out. God says, well, Bill, what do you think's going to happen? And I say, well, I think I won't be able to take care of myself and my family. And God says, well, Bill, haven't I taken care of you all these years, even when you was drinking? Have I once let you down? Have you ever begged for bread or slept under a bridge? I'll take care of you, Bill. No matter what happens in your life, we'll get through it. And what would I reply to that? You know what I'd say? Thank you, God. I need to believe that. That will be my part, my job. Because you see, I got my answer. I now know what I need to do. I need to believe that everything will be taken care of and that God will be on my side, no matter if the job works out or not. I know that I need to believe the answer that I received. If you don't understand this, or if you have any problems with it, just write me a message on the recoveryeffect.com website, and we'll work through it until we get it answered. I think this is a very effective exercise that I've used for numerous years, and I have never, now listen to me, I have never once seen it fail. There's always been an answer, and a good answer. So give it a try and let me know how it works out for you. If that doesn't work so good and you don't like that, what I would recommend that you do is write God a little letter. And then after you write it, act like you're God and write one back. Keep doing that until you get the answer. You'll know when the answer comes. You'll know, you'll feel it. There'll be a sense of, okay, I got my answer. It's over. I'm not going any further. There's no need to go any further. And you should also know what part you have to play in that answer. It's not just going to magically appear in the scenario I said. I realize that I have to believe that. And by believing that, that should give me the courage to make the job change I need to make. And if it doesn't work out, I have the faith and belief that He is going to take care of me. It will work out. So then I have the courage to move on. I have the courage to do what I'm supposed to do with my life. That right there, the God factor, the spiritual principle, gives me that courage to move on. So try to realize that every problem has a spiritual solution. You just have to find it, believe it, and do it. Every morning, spend some time on step 11, which is sought through prayer and meditation to improve our conscious contact with God. In other words, bring God into these matters, just like we did in that exercise. It will not turn you into a saint, but I can assure you it will help you greatly. And don't expect to never have fear. Don't expect that there'll come a time in your life where you won't have fear. You will always need God in this program. Sometimes the best you can hope for is just getting through the fear. And sometimes that's enough. In a lot of the cases, you can never expect a perfect release from all fears. We wouldn't be human if that was the case. We'd be some kind of an angel or something, but we wouldn't be human because we know that we're always going to have some type of fear. And so reducing and having the courage to not let these fears rule us is a key to a successful living. I know, and I suspect you do too, that we live in a very dangerous world. I mean, there's floods, tornadoes, earthquakes, fires, droughts. People get murdered, raped, robbed. There's car wrecks. I know it can be very frightful when you look at things, accepting that life is the way it is, and some things are out of our control, lets us move on. And we can say, oh, well, if it happens, it happens. I can't control everything. Check this out. What if I told you that I could reduce your fear by 85% immediately? Really, what if I told you that? How would you like to have 85% of all your fears eliminated? I bet you all would take me up on that offer. Well, I'm getting ready to offer you that right now. Do you know what? There's been studies done, and it has become a proven fact that 85% of what we worry and have fear about never come true. It never happens. It's a fact, folks. They've taken people and had them write down their fears and then followed up and have found out that 85% of those never came true. And of the 12% of the fears that did come true, it wasn't as bad as the person predicted, and they handled it much better than they expected. Now, I know you can identify with that. Maybe you was in jail, or maybe you had to go back for sentencing and you just shook in your boots, and that fear did come true. But in most of the cases, it just wasn't as bad as you predicted, or that you handled it a lot better than you thought you would. You didn't break down. You didn't go crazy. None of that happened. So look, 85% of your fears never come true. 12% of those fears that did happen, it wasn't as bad as a person predicted, and that person handled it way better than they thought they would. So what does this mean? This means that 97% of the fears you have is nothing more than exaggeration and misperception. It's a fantasy. They don't come true, and the few that do wasn't as bad as you thought they would be. Isn't that great? That right there should reduce your fears by 85%. It should at least give you confidence that things are going to be okay. That you only have to face 15% of your fears, and 12% of those are not going to be as bad as you thought they was. So fear is a character defect, a spiritual problem, not some psychological problem requiring medication. I mean, really, folks, what do? Come to this person and say, I have a fear of losing my job. Here, take this medication and you won't have that fear. I mean, where does it go? It's still there. The fear of living is still there. You just don't feel it as bad. But it doesn't dissipate. The medication doesn't erase it. Those can only be erased or at least reduced through spiritual principles. Is there anything more ludicrous than that? We need to deal with these fears. We need to realize that they're spiritual based and they're going to require a spiritual solution. So in conclusion to all this, what do we say? Well, we say that fear is a spiritual problem, not a psychological medical problem. That 85% of our fears never come true. That we have to bring God into our fears. We actually have to communicate with Him about our exact fears. And we need to talk to another human being about them. Especially if you're suffering from the fear of not knowing how to live, not knowing how to get through life's problems. All you have to do there is find somebody in your home group that's in your program that you feel has succeeded at life and has the answers on how to live, and ask him to help you. Folks, it's that simple. Just find somebody in the program that's more successful at what you're wanting to do. Find that person, and they'll show you how to do it. We need to work the program, especially steps 4 and 5 and 6 and 7, especially the part on fear. Don't do a treatment center step work. Do the 12-step work. And don't expect to not have any fears in your life. This is the world, and we're human beings. We'll always have fears. What we have to do is ask God to remove as many as possible and then learn to deal with the rest. I mean, can you even imagine that God would want us to just be totally fearless in this world? No. These are good spiritual exercises that I'm sure we're going to benefit from as we work our way through them. Spend some time in prayer and meditation. You'll find your answers there. And we also need to have the faith that nothing can happen to us that we can't handle with God in this program. And remember, most fears can be traced to self-centered fear. Fear of losing something you have or not getting something you want. When you find a fear crop up, trace it down to where the selfishness is at and immediately ask God to remove it. So today, folks, you have a choice. You have a choice to handle fear with God or to handle fear without God. Because you see, God is either everything or He's nothing. You cannot have faith like a smorgasbord. You can't go along and pick out the things that you think God can handle and the things he can't handle. It just doesn't work like that. You have to use these spiritual principles because, you see, obedience to spiritual principles reduces fear. Disobedience to spiritual principles increases fear. You know, the fear of the law is the greatest when you're committing a crime, meaning that your fear of the law is greatest when you're disobedient to the law. Those that are obedient to the law have way less fear than those who are disobedient, and it's the same way with spiritual principles. Of course, those who are obedient to spiritual principles reduces their fear and have a much fearless life than those who are disobedient to spiritual principles. I truly believe that our fear is in direct proportion to our obedience to spiritual principles. In other words, the more obedient we are to spiritual principles, the less fear we have. The more disobedient we are to spiritual principles, the greater the fear rises. You see, if medication and that kind of stuff would have worked, it would have worked long ago. The world is suffering more from fear now than it ever has, or at least in my lifetime. And I was one of the children that was raised where the teacher taught us how to put our heads under our desk when the atom bomb hit, and things are way worse than they were then. God is everything or he's nothing. Either God can't handle anything, meaning you don't think he can handle his fear, or he can handle everything, which you mean he can handle his fear. And one last thing that I hope you never forget, that without help it is too much for us. But there is one who has all power. That one is God. May you find him now.
Thanks for listening to The Recovery Effect with Bill Vineyard. Check out more at therecoveryeffect.com and facebook.com/therecoveryeffect. And don't forget to give us a 5-star rating on iTunes.